Before Adolf Hitler had consolidated his grip on Germany, before the world had even learned to fear the word fascism, one man had already built the blueprint. He wasn't born into power. He didn't inherit a throne. He seized it, and once he had it, he used it in ways that shocked even his own allies. This is the story of Benito Mussolini and what he was truly capable of. Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini was born on July 29, 1883, in Predappio, a small village in the Emilia-Romagna region of northern Italy. His father, Alessandro, was a blacksmith and a committed socialist. His mother, Rosa, was a schoolteacher. From the very beginning, Mussolini absorbed radical politics the way other children absorb religion. As a young man, he was restless, combative, and frequently expelled from schools for violent behavior. He stabbed a fellow student with a penknife on more than one occasion. Teachers described him as brilliant but ungovernable. He had a hunger for dominance that no classroom or institution could contain. In his 20s, he became a committed socialist journalist and agitator, cultivating a reputation as a firebrand speaker with a gift for working crowds into a frenzy. But World War I changed him. When Italy entered the war in 1915, Mussolini broke violently with socialism and embraced aggressive nationalism. He served, was wounded in a training exercise in 1917, and returned home hardened and radicalized, convinced that parliamentary democracy was too weak and too corrupt to lead Italy into the future he imagined. In 1919, he founded the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, the Italian combat leagues, in Milan. The movement took its name from the fasces, an ancient Roman symbol of bundled rods representing collective authority. The symbolism was deliberate. Mussolini wanted Italians to feel the weight of Rome's legacy. The movement attracted veterans, nationalists, and young men who felt humiliated by Italy's treatment after the war. Despite fighting on the winning side, Italy had been largely excluded from the territorial rewards promised at the Paris Peace Conference. The Italian public called it the mutilated victory, and the sense of betrayal was raw and festering. Mussolini turned that resentment into fuel. His black shirts, the squadristi, conducted organized violence against socialists, union organizers, and political opponents. They burned opposition newspaper offices, attacked elected officials, and forced men to drink castor oil in public as an act of degradation. The Italian government, paralyzed by political instability and fearful of a communist uprising, largely looked the other way. By 1921, the fascist movement had entered the Italian parliament as a formal political party. By October 1922, Mussolini had organized the March on Rome, a mass mobilization of black shirts threatening to seize the capital by force. King Victor Emmanuel III chose to capitulate rather than call the military's bluff. On October 29, 1922, he appointed Mussolini as Prime Minister of Italy. Mussolini was 39 years old. He had not won an election. He had intimidated his way to the top, and the Italian state had let him. What came next, however, was far worse than anyone anticipated, and the first real test of what Mussolini was willing to do came not on a battlefield, but in a courtroom. In May 1924, a socialist member of parliament named Giacomo Matteotti stood up in the Italian Chamber of Deputies and did something extraordinarily dangerous. He publicly challenged the results of the April 1924 elections, presenting detailed evidence of widespread intimidation, fraud, and violence carried out by the fascists. He named names. He cited specific cases. He was methodical, thorough, and utterly fearless. The chamber was hostile. Fascist deputies jeered and threatened him as he spoke. When he sat down, he reportedly turned to a colleague and said words to the effect that he had now delivered his speech, and that they could prepare whatever they wished for him. He knew exactly what he had done. 11 days later, on June 10, 1924, Matteotti was seized on a street in Rome by 5 men connected to the fascist secret police. He was forced into a car, stabbed multiple times during a violent struggle, and his body was buried in a shallow grave outside the city. It wasn't discovered until August. The country was stunned. Even Italians who had quietly tolerated fascism were shaken by the brazenness of it. Opposition deputies abandoned parliament in what became known as the Aventine Secession, a reference to ancient Rome when plebeians withdrew from public life in protest. For a brief window, Mussolini's grip on power appeared genuinely vulnerable. The press turned on him. Foreign governments expressed alarm. His own allies were nervous. But the king refused to act. The army stayed in its barracks. And Mussolini, rather than backing down, doubled down. On January 3, 1925, he stood before Parliament and delivered one of the most audacious speeches in modern political history. He effectively dared Parliament to indict him, taking personal responsibility for the political climate that had led to Matteotti's death, while stopping just short of confessing direct involvement. He framed the killing not as a crime, but as a consequence of Italy's political disorder, a disorder that only stronger, more decisive leadership could prevent. It was a masterstroke of political intimidation, dressed up as accountability. Within weeks, he dismantled what remained of Italy's free press. Opposition newspapers were shut down or seized. Political parties other than the fascists were banned. The secret police, the OVRA, were formalized and empowered to arrest, exile, or eliminate enemies of the state. The Matteotti murder didn't end Mussolini's reign. It ended Italian democracy. From 1925 onward, Mussolini governed not as a prime minister, but as a dictator. He gave himself the title Il Duce, the leader, and set about transforming every institution of Italian life in his image. But eliminating political opponents was just the beginning. What Mussolini did next stretched far beyond Italy's borders, and the consequences would be felt by hundreds of thousands of people who had never heard his name. Long before World War II began, Mussolini was already conducting what historians now describe as one of the most brutal colonial campaigns of the 20th century. Italy had held control of Libya since 1911, but resistance from the local population, particularly from the eastern region of Cyrenaica, had never fully been suppressed. The Senussi religious movement, led by the guerrilla commander Omar Mukhtar, had maintained a determined armed resistance for years. When Mussolini came to power, he ordered a final, comprehensive campaign to pacify Libya once and for all. The man he put in charge was General Pietro Badoglio, later joined by General Rodolfo Graziani, who would earn the nickname the Butcher of Fezzan. What followed was systematic and deliberate. Between 1929 and 1932, the Italian military constructed a barbed wire fence stretching over 270 kilometers along the Egyptian border, built specifically to cut off Omar Mukhtar's fighters from their supply lines and outside support. The civilian population of Cyrenaica, the nomadic and semi-nomadic Bedouin communities who had lived in those lands for generations, were forcibly removed from their territories and confined to concentration camps in the desert lowlands. These were not detention facilities in any modern humane sense. They were holding areas with minimal food, contaminated water, almost no medical care, and crushing overcrowding. The death toll inside those camps was catastrophic. Historians estimate that the population of Cyrenaica was reduced by roughly half during this period. Out of a population of approximately 225,000 people, in 1928, somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 died from disease, starvation, and violence. By 1932, the Italian Air Force conducted bombing campaigns against villages and suspected rebel encampments. There are documented instances of the use of mustard gas in these operations, in direct violation of the 1925 Geneva Protocol that Italy had signed. Omar Mukhtar was finally captured in September 1931. He was 73 years old. He was given a brief military trial, found guilty of rebellion, and hanged publicly in front of thousands of assembled prisoners and civilians. A deliberate act of humiliation designed to break the spirit of the resistance. The resistance, for all practical purposes, ended. But Libya was not the only place where Mussolini's forces deployed chemical weapons and deliberate terror against civilian populations. The worst was yet to come, and it unfolded on a scale that put even the Libyan campaign in the shade. On October 3, 1935, Italian forces invaded the Kingdom of Ethiopia, one of the only African nations that had never been colonized by a European power. The invasion was not provoked. It was not a response to aggression. It was naked imperial conquest, driven by Mussolini's obsession with building a new Roman Empire in Africa. Ethiopia was led by Emperor Haile Selassie, who would become one of the most recognized figures in the world during the months that followed. The military mismatch was staggering. Italy deployed modern aircraft, tanks, artillery, and a force eventually numbering over 400,000 men. Ethiopia's army was largely equipped with rifles and light weapons, many of them outdated. Ethiopian soldiers fought with extraordinary courage, but they were facing an industrialized military machine, and Mussolini had ordered his commanders to win at any cost. What followed was a systematic campaign that violated nearly every existing convention of warfare. Italian aircraft dropped mustard gas, delivered in bombs and sprayed from low-flying planes, on Ethiopian soldiers and civilians alike. Red Cross medical facilities, clearly marked with the internationally protected emblem, were bombed repeatedly. Haile Selassie later stated before the League of Nations that Italian aircraft had specifically targeted medical facilities, describing attacks on field hospitals and ambulance convoys. The gas attacks caused horrific suffering. Mustard gas causes severe blistering of exposed skin, blindness, and respiratory damage. Ethiopian soldiers had no protective equipment and no understanding of what they were facing. Many removed their shoes to treat burns on their feet, not realizing they were exposing themselves further. Civilians near military operations were also caught in the contamination. In February and March 1937, following an assassination attempt against Marshal Graziani in Addis Ababa, Italian forces and black-shirt paramilitaries conducted a 3-day massacre in the city. Thousands of Ethiopian civilians were killed in reprisal. Estimates range from 7,000 to 30,000 dead. The Ethiopian Orthodox monks and scholars at the monastery of Debre Libanos, one of the most sacred sites in the country, were executed en masse on suspicion of involvement in the resistance. The League of Nations condemned the invasion and imposed economic sanctions on Italy, the first time in history that a major international body had taken collective action against an aggressor nation. But the sanctions were limited, deliberately excluding oil, which would have genuinely crippled Italy's military operations. Britain kept the Suez Canal open to Italian supply ships throughout the conflict. The sanctions failed. Ethiopia fell. On May 9, 1936, Mussolini stood on the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia in Rome and declared the founding of the Italian Empire. Victor Emmanuel III was proclaimed Emperor of Ethiopia. The crowds below cheered. Within months, Mussolini would deepen his alliance with the one leader in Europe who had watched all of this with admiration and taken careful notes. The Ethiopian conquest had one significant diplomatic consequence Mussolini had not fully anticipated. It isolated Italy from Britain and France, pushing him toward the one major European power that had supported him, Nazi Germany. Hitler had come to power in 1933, and the two leaders had been watching each other carefully. Mussolini had initially viewed Hitler as an imitator, and Germany as a rival for influence in Austria. The shared experience of international condemnation over Ethiopia changed that. In October 1936, Italy and Germany formalized what Mussolini himself called the Rome-Berlin Axis, a term that would define the coming war. The following year, Italy joined the Anti-Comintern Pact alongside Germany and Japan. But before the Second World War officially began, both Mussolini and Hitler found a testing ground in Spain, when General Francisco Franco launched his military uprising against the elected Spanish Republican government in July 1936. Mussolini intervened almost immediately. Over the course of the Spanish Civil War, Italy deployed approximately 70,000 to 80,000 troops to fight alongside Franco's nationalist forces, along with aircraft, tanks, artillery, and substantial financial support. Italian forces participated in some of the most controversial actions of that war, including the bombing of civilian areas, the destruction of the Basque town of Guernica in April 1937. Carried out primarily by the German Condor Legion, with Italian aircraft also operating in the region, became one of the defining atrocities of the decade. Back in Italy, Mussolini had constructed a surveillance state of remarkable thoroughness. The OVRA, the Organization for Vigilance and Repression of Anti-Fascism, monitored mail, telephone communications, and public gatherings. Informants were embedded throughout Italian society, in workplaces, apartment buildings, and social clubs. Citizens who expressed anti-fascist opinions risked arrest, internal exile to remote southern Italian towns or islands, imprisonment, or worse. A special tribunal for the defense of the state, established in 1926, operated outside the normal judicial system to prosecute political crimes. Between 1927 and 1943, it sentenced thousands of people to prison terms, totaling tens of thousands of years in aggregate, along with a smaller number of death sentences. The most prominent target of this system was Antonio Gramsci, the founder of the Italian Communist Party and one of the most important political thinkers of the 20th century. Gramsci was arrested in 1926 and held in prison for the rest of his life, dying in 1937 from the toll of poor conditions and untreated illness. The fascist prosecutor assigned to his case reportedly told the tribunal they needed to stop his brain from working for 20 years. Gramsci wrote extensively while imprisoned, producing notebooks that would become enormously influential long after his death. But it cost him everything. The domestic repression was thorough and deliberate, designed not just to eliminate active opponents, but to make ordinary Italians feel that dissent was impossible, that silence was survival. And then, in 1938, Mussolini took a step that shocked many Italians who had tolerated everything else. Until 1938, Italy's Jewish community had largely been integrated into Italian society in ways that stood in marked contrast to the situation in Germany. Italian Jews had fought in World War I, participated in politics, served in Mussolini's own fascist movement, and occupied prominent positions in business, academia, and the professions. Mussolini himself had, at various points, made dismissive or even contemptuous remarks about Nazi racial ideology, calling it scientifically absurd. Then, in July 1938, the fascist regime published the Manifesto of Racial Scientists, a document asserting the existence of a distinct Italian race and laying the pseudo-scientific groundwork for discrimination. 2 months later, in September and November 1938, the Italian government enacted the racial laws. The laws were sweeping and immediate in their impact. Jewish children were expelled from public schools. Jewish teachers were removed from universities. Jewish people were barred from government employment, the military, and the professions. Mixed marriages between Jews and non-Jews were prohibited. Foreign Jews who had settled in Italy after 1919 were ordered to leave the country within 6 months. Jewish-owned businesses were subject to confiscation. Jewish people were removed from the census. In practical terms, Italian Jews were stripped of citizenship in all but name. The Italian Jewish community numbered approximately 47,000 people at the time, a tiny fraction of the total population, with no history of the kind of social hostility that had existed elsewhere in Europe. Many families had lived in Italy for centuries, some since the Roman Republic. The speed and severity of the laws stunned them. Some prominent Italians protested privately. The Vatican expressed reservations, particularly about provisions affecting Jewish people who had converted to Catholicism. But there was no mass public outcry, no organized resistance from Italian civil society. Mussolini had crossed a line that many of his own supporters had not expected him to cross, and the Jewish community of Italy was left exposed in ways that would become catastrophic once Germany occupied northern and central Italy after 1943. But there is one dimension of Mussolini's personal conduct during these years that reveals something about the nature of the regime itself, something that went far beyond policy and ideology. Mussolini's private life was, by any standard, a prolonged exercise in the abuse of power. He was married to Rachele Guidi, with whom he had 5 children, and a relationship that lasted on paper for decades. But throughout his time in power, Mussolini maintained a series of relationships with other women, conducted openly and with the full knowledge of his inner circle. The most significant, and the most troubling in terms of what it reveals about the dynamics of power in fascist Italy, was his relationship with Clara Petacci. Clara Petacci was 28 years younger than Mussolini. She came from a well-connected Roman family, and the two first met in 1932, when she was 20 years old. Their relationship deepened through the mid-1930s, and by the late 1930s, she had become his primary companion, installed in a private apartment in the Palazzo Venezia, the same building that housed Mussolini's official offices. Clara's family benefited substantially from the connection. Her brother, Marcello, accumulated considerable wealth through government contracts and business dealings that were made possible by proximity to power. Her sister pursued an acting career, aided by official favoritism. But what surrounded the Petacci relationship was a broader culture within the fascist regime, in which Mussolini's personal desires were treated as commands, and in which women who attracted his attention had little practical ability to refuse. Multiple accounts from the period, drawn from secret police records, diaries, and memoirs, describe a pattern in which the Ovra monitored Mussolini's female acquaintances, intercepted their correspondence, and facilitated his access to women he was interested in. The line between personal interest and institutional coercion was, in practice, non-existent. This was the nature of the regime. The state served the man. Every institution, from the secret police to the courts to the press, existed to protect and extend Mussolini's personal power and personal will. There was no domain of Italian life that was genuinely independent of it, which made what happened next, when the war began to turn against him, all the more dramatic. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, and Britain and France declared war, Mussolini declared Italy non-belligerent. His military was not ready. Despite years of propaganda about Italy's martial prowess, Italian industry was far weaker than Germany's, the army was under-equipped, and the campaigns in Ethiopia and Spain had drained resources without producing the battle-hardened force Mussolini imagined he had. But watching Germany's stunning victories in France in the spring of 1940, Mussolini convinced himself that the war would be over quickly, and that he needed to enter before it ended, before the territorial spoils were divided. On June 10, 1940, with France already collapsing, Mussolini declared war on Britain and France. Franklin D. Roosevelt, speaking at the University of Virginia that same day, described it as the moment when the hand that held the dagger had struck it into its neighbor's back. The phrase captured the international reaction precisely. What followed was a series of military disasters that systematically destroyed whatever remained of Italy's international credibility. In October 1940, without informing Hitler in advance, in part to demonstrate Italian independence, Mussolini ordered the invasion of Greece from Italian-controlled Albania. The Greek army, fighting on its own terrain and with extraordinary tenacity, stopped the Italian advance and then pushed back, driving Italian forces back into Albania. It was one of the most humiliating military defeats in Italian history, and it required Germany to intervene in the Balkans in April 1941 to rescue the situation, delaying the German invasion of the Soviet Union by critical weeks. In North Africa, Italian forces advanced into British-controlled Egypt in September 1940 and then stopped. In December, the British launched a counter-offensive, Operation Compass, that in 10 weeks destroyed 10 Italian divisions, captured over 130,000 prisoners, and pushed Italian forces hundreds of miles back into Libya. Germany again had to intervene, this time in the form of the Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel. In East Africa, Italian forces held Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland until May 1941, when the last Italian units surrendered. The empire Mussolini had declared in 1936 had lasted less than 5 years. Each of these failures cost Italian lives, Italian equipment, and Italian resources on a massive scale, and they placed Italy in an increasingly subordinate position to Germany, the very dependency that Mussolini had spent 20 years trying to avoid. At home, the Italian population, which had cheered the declaration of war with some enthusiasm in 1940, was growing exhausted, hungry, and deeply disillusioned. The Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943 was the breaking point. On the night of July 24th to 25th, 1943, the Fascist Grand Council, the very body that was supposed to be the inner sanctum of Mussolini's power, voted to strip him of military command. It was the first time the council had voted against him in 21 years. The following day, Mussolini went to meet King Victor Emmanuel III, expecting to discuss the political situation. Instead, the king told him his resignation had been accepted and had him arrested as he left the meeting. A carabinieri officer informed him he was being taken into custody for his own protection. After 2 decades of absolute power, Mussolini was led out of the villa in an ambulance and taken first to a police barracks, then to a series of increasingly remote locations. Italy surrendered to the Allies on September 8, 1943. The following day, German forces began occupying northern and central Italy. On September 12, 1943, a German Special Forces operation led by SS officer Otto Skorzeny landed gliders on the Gran Sasso Plateau in the Apennines, where Mussolini was being held in a mountain hotel. The rescue, Operation Oak, extracted him without a shot being fired, flying him to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. Hitler's intention was to restore Mussolini to power in German-occupied Italy. The result was the Italian Social Republic, the Salo Republic, a puppet state in northern Italy, named after the small town on Lake Garda, where its offices were based. Mussolini, once the undisputed master of Italy, was now entirely dependent on German military protection. He knew it, the Germans knew it, even his remaining supporters knew it, but within the narrow confines of what power he still held, Mussolini used it with characteristic brutality. One of the first acts of the Salo Republic was the Verona trials of January 1944, in which fascist leaders who had voted against Mussolini on July 25, 1943, were tried for treason. Among the defendants was Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's own son-in-law and former foreign minister. Ciano, along with 4 others, was convicted and executed by firing squad on January 11, 1944. Etta Mussolini had pleaded desperately for her husband's life, including in direct appeals to her father. Mussolini did not intervene. Meanwhile, under German occupation and with the active collaboration of the Salo Republic's forces, the deportation of Italian Jews began. Between late 1943 and the end of the war, approximately 8,000 Italian Jews were deported to German extermination camps. Fewer than 1,000 returned. The consequence was the near-total destruction of communities that had existed in Italy for 2,000 years. By early 1945, the war in Italy was nearly over. Allied forces had pushed steadily northward. German forces were retreating. The Salo Republic was collapsing. On April 25, 1945, with Allied forces closing in and German commanders in Italy in secret negotiations to surrender, Mussolini left Milan. His intention, according to those with him at the time, was to make his way to the Valtellina, a mountainous region near the Swiss border where fascist diehards had spoken of making a last stand. He joined a German convoy heading north along the western shore of Lake Como. On April 27th, the convoy was stopped near the town of Dongo by Italian communist partisans. Mussolini was found hiding in the back of a German military truck, wearing a German coat and helmet. He was recognized, taken into custody, and held overnight in a farmhouse in the village of Bonzanigo. The following afternoon, April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Clara Petacci, who had refused to leave his side, were shot by partisan forces at the gate of a villa in the village of Giulino di Mezzegre. The exact details of what happened and who gave the final order remain a subject of historical debate to this day. Their bodies, along with those of several other executed fascist officials, were transported overnight to Milan and hung upside down from a petrol station roof in the Piazzale Loreto, the same square where, in August 1944, fascist forces had displayed the bodies of 15 executed partisans. The symbolism was intentional. The crowds that gathered in Piazzale Loreto on April 29, 1945, responded with a fury that reflected more than 2 decades of accumulated fear, grief, and suppressed rage. The images from that day are among the most striking of the entire war. 2 days later, Hitler ended his own life in Berlin. On May 2nd, German forces in Italy surrendered. On May 8th, the war in Europe was over. Benito Mussolini had been in power for 20 years, 8 months, and 26 days. He had built a dictatorship, launched wars of conquest, deployed chemical weapons against civilian populations, established concentration camps on 2 continents, enacted racial laws that delivered tens of thousands of people to their deaths, and constructed a machinery of surveillance and repression that penetrated every corner of Italian life. He had wanted to restore the Roman Empire. He had destroyed the country he claimed to love. The Italy that emerged from the ruins of his regime spent decades reckoning with what had happened, with who had known, who had cooperated, and what it meant that an entire nation had, for so long, let him continue. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.